wanted to start by giving you just a little bit of background of a few things that I've done. Wow. This is going to be about getting your attention, so that was just a test. Glad it worked. So the reason I want to talk about my background is I think it explains where I'm coming from today. So I did start off in journalism working at This American Life, and I really did want to know what was their magic formula for keeping people's attention. I hope when Lisa Pollock speaks, she can talk to you a little bit more about that. Then I came to the New York Times, and I was doing multimedia. And my whole mission was trying to figure out interesting ways to get people involved in really difficult stories, like this multimedia project on a business story about private equity. And then, I've had 7 jobs in 7 years at the Times, and they also allowed me, I feel like, to be a traditional print reporter, did stories for the front page. But every time I was doing a story for the Times, I really tried to do something like different and digital with it. So I would put animated GIFs in my stories and do anything I could to figure out how do we get new readers, younger readers, how do we keep people's attention in a traditional newspaper story. And then I realized something else, that storytelling by itself, even just playing around with these digital formats and things like Snowfall and everything, is important, but it's not the whole answer to how storytelling is changing right now. So to look at that, I want to go back about 150 years. So the New York Times has been around that long, and it's kind of a daily miracle. I mean, to put together this giant newspaper, 1,000 people in our newsroom, there are 150 years of habits and practices and behaviors that these journalists have learned to put out this daily newspaper. And in an era where our sole source of information was a newspaper, or maybe, like gossip at your local coffee house or something, this was an incredibly efficient way to get your news, right? Everything we did about the way the headlines were written, the way the stories were written, was an incredibly efficient, smart way for people to get information. But today we might learn about the same story, the Titanic sinking, a little bit differently. You could imagine, like, if we learned about it on Twitter. When we're comparing these two worlds, there's a lot that's changed. We are literally, as some of the previous speakers have said, we are drowning in stories, 3,500 messages a day. That's crazy. No human beings in history have ever dealt with this much kind of narrative input before. But other things have changed as well. This is my favorite example of this. I love this slide. So in 2005, when Pope Francis was announced, this was the picture in St. Peter's Square. All right. I want you to notice the one little early adopter in the lower right-hand corner, guy with the flip phone. Just a few years later, this was Pope Benedict. When Pope Francis was announced, this was the same scene. Like, our world is totally different, and this just happened. So this presents kind of a crazy problem for us as storytellers, right? Because now people are behaving in radically different ways. And the biggest shift that I think we have to contend with as storytellers is that right now content is basically infinite. There is more that you could read, there's more than you could see, there's more you could watch than you could possibly get through in a lifetime, right? Your attention, however, is finite. There is a limit to how much time you can spend drinking in the world. So this is the central problem today. This was very opposite of the problems of 100 years ago, where information was scarce and really valued. So one of the ways that we've been thinking about this at the New York Times, and this is our sort of favorite metaphor for this big shift, is that 150 years ago, or actually 100 years ago, is really when home delivery started, when we brought the paper to your house. We wanted you to read the newspaper so badly that we printed it out on paper, loaded it on trucks, and sent little boys on bicycles to go to your house and throw the news at you. They would literally throw it at your house. Today, we publish the same kinds of stories written in the same format, and we put them up in the most crowded content landscape in all of human history, and we just expect you to come to our website and find it. So that doesn't always translate. Now, I want to back up a little bit here, and now we're going to get into kind of the crazy imagination part of the session. I want to talk about how we as human beings signal that something is important, because I think we have to rethink this now in this new age. So as human beings, we're naturally pretty good at signaling things that are important. It's kind of built in. If I really wanted to get your attention right now, I could get really upset, I could get angry, I could show emotion, or I could be really enthusiastic. It would be the most amazing thing I'm going to tell you guys today. I could get loud, which I did in both of those. Or I could come over and interrupt whatever you're doing, whoever's on your phone. I could come over and take your phone out of your hand and say, no, listen to me. You right there on your phone. Hi, yeah, I'm here, thanks. So I could do that. I could interrupt you. I could repeat myself. We do that a lot. Hey, the kid who tugs on their mom's sleeves 1,000 times, Mom, Mom, Mom. Or, and we'll get to this, I could act strangely. If I just stopped talking all of a sudden, you guys would wonder what's going on. All right. I was waiting for that second laugh. All right, so, okay, now you're all thinking we all get loud or upset sometimes, and what does this have to do with news, right? Actually, so all of these things we see variations of in traditional journalism. And I want to play you a clip right now. You've probably all seen this clip before. It's a famous news clip from the beginning of broadcast history. But I want you to pay attention to the voice of the announcer and to listen for how he's communicating that this is important and urgent. What are you hearing in his voice?
And a nervous tension grips those who are watching, for this is something unusual.
The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flames. Get it started. It's crashing terrible. Oh, my, get out of the way, please. It's bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast, and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the fans just feeding around it.
Okay, so you heard some of those things in that clip, right? He gets emotional. He talks faster. You probably also noticed he talked in a higher pitch. That was just his tape recorder that day was running slow, so his voice was lower in reality. But if you keep listening, about a further minute into the clip, he just can't talk anymore. It's so overwhelming to this very seasoned broadcast journalist that he has no words. And that's sort of the strangest thing of all, right? Now, in print journalism, we know how to get your attention. Boom. Men walk on moon. We can shout at you and scream at you with a giant headline. Timeless, tested strategy. And we can interrupt you. Broadcast journalists are great at this.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington.
We interrupt our program to bring you a special broadcast. The German news agency...
We interrupt this program to bring you a news bulletin from Washington. The White House has just announced...
Here is a news bulletin. Shots have reportedly been fired.
Here's another late development, and this news keeps coming in.
This is an NBC News hotline report.
So they're all using this urgent tone of voice. They're breaking into your regular programming. And I let that clip run to a little music at the end because I thought that was a special tell of whether they're really telling you, okay, this is completely different. And in our world of cable news, another thing we do, like the kid tugging on the sleeve to mom, we do this with big stories all the time. It's just like wall-to-wall coverage of a subject every day, day in, day out for days. And this can be totally effective when the news is strong enough. But certainly there are cases where that can go to excess. But in terms of strangeness, you see this probably most often, this final quality, in the magazine world. This is a New Yorker cover after September 11th. You probably can't see it with the projector. It's mostly black, but in the middle there's two very subtly darker colors of the Twin Towers. But again, you just think the cover's black, which is so strange for a magazine that you're going to look closer and pay attention. Now, I want to stop here. Any of these techniques applied to journalism can be done badly. So I'm not saying we should all shout and yell and get emotional, but used judiciously or in interesting narrative-supporting ways, they can be really effective. So just to summarize what those were, some human signals for importance. I just invented this list this week, so add to the list or come up with your own. Emotion, loudness, interruption, repetition, and strange behavior. So keep this in mind, because we're going to think about it a little more as we progress. So how do we get our news today? We talked a little bit about the rise of the phone. Everybody's got a phone in their pocket. I would also call this sort of what's happening on the phone is also the rise of what I would call the feed. And, we're living in an age of feeds. If this is a symbolic feed, there's a lot of different things you call a feed, from email, mobile alerts, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever social media, thing of your choice, but also some technologies that are not social media, like just alerts on your phone. And these feeds are incredibly psychologically addictive. They're really powerful. They suck up your attention like a kind of insane psychological vacuum cleaner, right? How many of you have been like, I can't get off email, or I'm constantly checking Twitter or Facebook, right? Like it pulls us in this way that we don't fully control. And so these feeds are kind of taking our attention away from where we might have normally opened up the newspaper. And that could be depressing, that could be sad, but I have a message of hope. We have a little room right here, a little magical window to use exactly what this conference is about, the power of storytelling, to win people's hearts and minds and bring them to our stories. And while many journalists and writers and storytellers, they labor over that first sentence, they think that first sentence is exactly, how the story is going to start, I would now argue that our story is starting here. And we should put the same care and attention into this moment as we would into the first sentence of our story. So what does this look like in real life? So this is a screenshot of my Twitter feed from 1 hour ago. You'll notice some very nice power of storytelling tweets in the middle here. Good job, everyone. It's funny, not long ago we have a new executive editor at the New York Times. His name is Dean Baquet, and he sent an email to a small group of us a couple of weeks ago. And I'm totally embarrassed about this, you guys. I never responded. Because I was paralyzed by his question. He asked a bunch of us, kind of some digital folks in the newsroom, so what are you guys really reading? Like, what news outlets do you think are really doing digital right? And I didn't have a news outlet, because I read Twitter. And, whatever comes up in Twitter is basically what I read, or what my friends recommend to me. And so it's not like I go to 6 different digital news sites. I just sort of see what comes in on the feed, and I didn't really have an answer for him. And I know not everyone that uses Twitter. I know certainly in this crowd, it's probably not the most popular social network. But for other people, this is email. They get email newsletters. For other people, this is Google searches. It can be Facebook, absolutely. And if this is not the way you read today, all of the trends and all of the data about reading behavior shows that this is only increasing. So some data this is a very abstract chart, but it is New York Times data. In the last 2 years, we have seen a decrease in traffic to our homepage of half. It's dropped by half. The number of people who used to come to NewYorkTimes.com have totally fallen. And we talked about this, and there was an innovation report that I worked on this year where we talked about some of these difficult numbers and what it means for the newspaper. And this is not unique to the New York Times. Homepage visits are declining all around the industry. And sometimes this chart looks worse at other places. The good news, though, is that this is just the homepage. Actual reading on our site is stable. It's not going down. People are just not using the front door anymore. They're coming in the side doors. So what are those side doors? Well, mobile is certainly one of them. On a mobile device, people are less likely to go to our main homepage. They might be on an app, scrolling through a feed. They might be on social media. Social media accounts for 50% of all internet traffic. That's crazy. News sites account for just 2%. So the good news here is that many people go to social media sites to read news. So again, we have that little window. So we're living in an age of feeds. But what kinds of things are taking up our attention within those feeds? If we look at those and we see things like, it's really mixed. You've got, rumors and baby pictures and funny videos and jokes about the news and your friends post and fragments that you don't understand and arguments you don't agree with and alerts you're kind of annoyed by and aggregated news from people who are stealing your story and writing it differently for a blog, and I hate that. Commentary, cat photos, and eventually, yes, news, right? So there's all this stuff in there. And if you look at the tactics that people are using to reach us in these feeds, and again, it can include Google and email and different things, they are using some of those things we talked about earlier, like yelling and emotion, and they interrupt your day, and they repeat themselves, and they do strange things. And it works for some of them. I mean, there's this whole rise of these viral sites that create clickbait that they put out in your feeds, and this stuff is really frustrating because they show up all the time. They're taking a lot of our attention. And even though clickbait can sort of work in the short term, it does ultimately, the audience stops trusting it over time. But if this kind of material can get into our lives through these feeds, why can't good storytelling do that too? That's one of the things I've been interested in for years, so I'm really excited to talk to you now about some specific strategies that we can use to do this. So I would argue you can't control the feed, but you can seed the feed, right? And that rhymes. So it's attention getting. Okay, let's back up a little bit. If we're just going to sprinkle our goodness in the feeds, how do we do that? I would argue we go back to the very theme of this conference. How do we tell good stories? So here I would say I am glad to sort of punt and tell all of you to pay really close attention to all the other speakers who are talking to you about narrative structure and good storytelling. I'm just going to breeze over that with like a cheat sheet. You can pay more attention to like Lisa Pollack and Chris Jones. They're all going to say great stuff. But here's just a cheat sheet of some stuff in good stories, right? So conflict, tension, mystery, suspense, cliffhanger, surprise, characters, emotion, high stakes, pleasure, meaning, facts, details, examples, anecdotes. So we're great at doing this stuff inside of our stories. Most of us who are engaged in the craft of storytelling, we know all these tricks, we use them all the time, but we suck, and I say we, meaning the New York Times and me, we suck at this when our stories travel beyond the pages of our own publication. We don't use these magical tools that engage our readers in a delightful way when our stories are traveling around on the interweb, And so why is that? Well, sources say journalists often use super boring headlines. That's one reason. Yeah. And you can see how this works. Like when we could be peppering this world with delicious stories to bring meaning and mystery and suspense to people, like that I think is much more, it's much more interesting. It's like a journalistic act. And we can build all of these things into those feeds, right, for our stories. But it's not enough, I think, just to sort of, try to do this. We have to do it really well because we are competing again with all this other junk, which is maybe lovely. I'm sure my sister posted something really cute about my niece yesterday. That's not junk, I guess. She's really cute. But getting your story to show up in this crowded environment can sometimes feel a little bit like this, like you've just tossed your story into a bottle on the vast ocean of the internet and you hope someone will read it. And that can feel like frustrating, and people don't know what to do. And I get these questions from New York Times journalists like every day. What can I do to my story so that people actually see it? I would argue that you could use each of these techniques on specific stories at any stage of the process. And now I just want to take you through. This is all a very new discipline. We're actually working on this right now. We don't have a lot of concrete answers. But I want to share with you right now some hypotheses of things we've been doing that are successful and some early experiments. So the first way you can use some of these storytelling techniques to sort of be in your reader's world is really to get into those feeds first. Typically when I would publish a story as a reporter, I would publish it, and then I would wait to see how people were talking about it on Twitter and watch it. And I would just watch it unfold. Well, there's no reason that we have to just wait and watch to see how these stories organically take hold. I know the story better than anybody reading it. I'm going to know the quote that's going to be the best quote that's going to travel far on the internet, so maybe I could put that out first. This can mean, getting into the feeds can mean everything from making sure this is a little boring, but the right Google search terms are in your headline. It can mean caring about whether your news organization has an app that has alerts so their phone buzzes when an important story happens. It could mean something as simple that any of you could do as having an email newsletter. Right now there's a whole set of kind of young freelance journalists who in the United States who started their own email newsletters just to tell their most passionate fans what they're writing this week. And those have been really great for people. Anne Friedman's is a really good one to check out if you want to look for an example of that. But it can also mean being on social media, and that's probably the most obvious example of getting into the feeds first. And I just want to show you one quick example. So here's a pretty standard story that we did at the Times this week. Sierra Leone's soccer team struggles with stigma over the Ebola outbreak. Classic, really interesting story, classic New York Times headline. And thank God for this. Lydia Polgreen, I love her. This is Lydia. You should all totally follow her on Twitter because she's really good at reading a story. She's a deputy editor on the Foreign Desk, former foreign correspondent. She's very, very good at reading a story and finding the narrative nuggets and taking them and putting them into social media so people are more interested in the stories. So with this story, Sierra Leone's soccer team struggling with stigma, we could have just put that headline out, but this is what she put out. She put this quote: "You feel humiliated, like garbage, and you want to punch someone. Sierra Leone goalkeeper on chance of Ebola." And then this other post. And so that's bringing emotion right into it, right? At this level. Second one, no handshakes, no jersey swaps, the Ebola curse on Sierra Leone's football team. Those are two telling details with high stakes. Again, we normally save these techniques for our writing, but I think you can do them anywhere. So that's just one example. The second tip is to really rethink what a headline is, right? Great headline writing is an art that we all think about because it is often traditionally the first way people encounter our stories. But now they exist very differently than they used to. So traditionally you've got a headline like this in the newspaper, right? Adapting to Chernobyl. You can kind of see that this is probably about wildlife, plants, animals. There's a spider web. You see the word Chernobyl. You get what the story is about. But today that doesn't really work as well because adapting to Chernobyl, if you take that away from this context of this newspaper, that's confusing. You don't know if it's about people or politics or what. But there was also a great video with this article, and the video initially had a kind of boring headline: "At Chernobyl, hints of nature's adaptation." And this is the kind of thing that just doesn't do very well on social media, because what does this mean when you don't have the photo? What does this mean outside of context? It's really hard to tell, right? We had a very smart, very direct editor, Bruce Headlam, who just renamed the thing Animals of Chernobyl. Everybody knows what the Animals of Chernobyl means, that you've got some pleasure in that, because usually animal things are kind of delightful, and mystery, because you don't know, okay, what has happened to the animals of Chernobyl? It's got what I would call an embedded narrative question right there, like Animals of Chernobyl is so compact, but already there's a mystery involved. Headlines can mean a lot of things. Again, this is an easy social media example, but I would also really encourage you to think, is my story the kind of story that people are going to talk about, or that people are going to want to look up and hunt for? If it's something they're going to want to look up, like I did a story once about parents who had to talk to really young kids who accidentally found internet pornography. And so I knew for that story that was not important to everybody, but if a parent had a 7-year-old kid who saw internet pornography, they were going to Google it. And so I did all this extra work to make that story search-friendly. And sure enough, we see lots of people hit it over time. It's a story with a long life, because I thought about, when I was writing the story, how people would find it. Headlines are important for this. If it's the other kind of story, a kind of story where someone's going to share and talk about, and maybe it's more timely, then you really want to think about the social media piece where digital conversation happens. The third point is to meet your audience where they live. And there are a lot of sort of subcategories on this. It could be anything from consider the best time of day to promote your story. If you're doing a story about Japan, maybe you should post it on social media when Japan is awake in the morning over there, not when they're asleep. Is it a story that would have a large overseas readership? What can you do to sort of translate some of the material for people who might be interested in? How can you think about your reader and their day and what they're interested in, and then make sure the story gets in front of them? So our most exciting example of this so far, this is really a brand new discipline for us, but we had this really powerful video. It was about a man who had survived an ISIS massacre. He was an Iraqi soldier. And ISIS had killed 300 of his comrades and just shot them all in a ditch. And he played dead. He was shot, he acted like he was dead. And then ISIS came around with a video camera and hey, we killed all these guys. This man escaped. He hid out for 3 days near a river when he was bleeding. He found another survivor who died on the riverbank. He eventually escaped to a home and then made his way to safety. And in this video, we showed him the clip where he could see himself playing dead on the YouTube video that ISIS had produced. This was a powerful piece of journalism. It was the kind of thing that we're all really proud of at the New York Times. And when we had it, we thought there was a team that looked at this and thought very much about, well, wait, how can we make sure that most people who want to see this will see it? And at the Times, we don't think everyone wants to see every story, but we do talk about a maximum natural audience for a story. The idea that anyone who's interested in this should get to see it. But if people are totally uninterested, we're not going to go chase them or create a clickbait headline to trick them into watching. We don't care about that. But we did some very interesting things with this one. One, we thought about the audience. We thought there would be a large Arabic-speaking audience interested in this video. So the video was translated. There was one video in both English and Arabic subtitles. We promoted it on social media in Arabic during the Arabic morning. We used different content distribution partners to get it, into different places. It was on YouTube and Dig and some other places where there were partnerships. And you know, with these two examples, we put in this Facebook post and this Twitter post. I think it was the first time we'd done them in Arabic, you know. But we really wanted to explain about the character, share some of the key facts, use that bit of storytelling in those posts. This video got more than 50 times what a standard New York Times video would get in terms of viewership, and we're proud of that. It's not like any kind of selling out, because we feel that this is the kind of important journalism that, if you know, on the front page we would put it right on the front with big letters and a big headline. So this is the equivalent of that. We're using all these different tools instead of that big headline. And it was successful from that point of view, and I think we're planning to do much more of that in the future. 4 is to help your readers tell the story with you. So this is another technique that we tested out when I worked on the New York Times' innovation report. We wanted to see if we could we have so much like amazing storytelling at the New York Times. We're like the world's biggest library, and we only let you check out the books that were written today. You know, we have all this great stuff, but it's sort of buried and hidden. So we took about six to eight, I think, stories that one of our columnists, Nick Kristof, has done over the last 20 years on sex trafficking. He was an early reporter to really cover the subject deeply, and so we just found like 6 to 8 of his best articles. He helped us go through them, and we just put them on this page. We called it Inside the Brothels. None of this was new reporting. These were all older stories. The oldest story was from 1993. And then what we did was we reached out to just 11 influencers. Now these are people, oh look, Lydia Polgreen, who we saw before, because she has a big Twitter following and she was based in India for a while. And so we targeted people that were either actively campaigning against sex trafficking or, you know, were sort of well-known in this world or had geographic connections to some of the stories. We sent 11 emails. Really simple emails. We didn't even ask them to tweet it or share it or put it anywhere. We just said, hey, we have this page we put together. We thought you'd be interested in seeing it. And sure enough, they all shared it on Twitter. They all thanked us for giving them the early notice that we had this page up. Then we sent a 12th email that no one has ever sent in the entire history of the New York Times. We wrote our homepage editor and we said, do not put this story up. We just want to see what we can do with these 11 emails alone. So the story went up, and a bunch of Twitter traffic happened. And in the tweets that other people wrote about this page, you had emotion. You had such a gut-wrenching story. How did you get the victims to tell their stories? You have the sense of larger meaning and stakes. Historians will call these stories pivotal in exposing sex trafficking in our era. You have characters and anecdotes. Mina's owner also wanted to breed her, as is common in Indian brothels. We didn't write any of that. But this is the way that many readers first found these stories. So in a way, these people on Twitter are almost like collaborators. You know, and we didn't really talk to them. You know, some of these people had seen it 3 times on Twitter and then chose to share something themselves. But they're doing, you know, small acts of storytelling that propel the original journalism forward. And the day it went live, I mean, we had a huge response. I mean, it was really something like 500,000 people read these stories. The oldest story from 1993, that day on the entire New York Times site, people spent more time with that old article than anything else on our site because they were just riveted by this story that was so well told, even though it was, you know, almost 2 decades old. So this was one of the most viewed features that we had the entire month. And one of the big surprises was one of the influencers ran a nonprofit, and they had a very influential celebrity on their board, and he tweeted it. We were very lucky to have Ashton Kutcher tweet it. Because, you know, he cares about sex trafficking. He doesn't want people to be sex trafficked. So basically, there are 4 new ways to start your story. To get into other people's feeds first, to rethink your headlines and what those mean, to meet your audience where they live, think about their lives, and put your story in front of them, and then help your readers tell the story with you. Now, we're just experimenting with all this right now. We don't have all the answers, and so I want to leave you with 2 things that I frequently close a talk with. One is one of my favorite quotes. It's by Alvin Toffler. He's a futurist. And he says, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who can't read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And I like to share that because these answers won't be correct in a year or 2 years or 3 years. We all have to keep learning and experimenting. There's no single answer. And I would encourage you to experiment with your own stories and telling them earlier in the communication cycle with your readers in digital space. And the second thing I want to share is just a little bit of a framework for how our work has really changed. It used to be that the job of a journalist or a storyteller was to have an idea, to report it, and then create it, to write it, to put it together. But that work has really expanded. And now we also are doing the work of packaging and promoting our stories, and then listening and responding to our readers. So for each one of these, there's a set of new questions I think we have to ask. So the first, when you have an idea, because people's attention is so strained, we have to think about what is surprising, what do people really need to know, what's not being covered by anyone else. When we're reporting, what will people be curious about? What can you find that no one else has? And what will make you smile or think? When you're creating a story, how will you make it compelling? Are there other formats that are more useful than text? And why should people stay to the end of your story? When you're packaging it, you want to also think about things like the headline and the photo and how they're going to help people see your story on its first impression. Does the story have everything a reader needs, or are they going to get in the story and get distracted and go somewhere else for a document or a video? And then have you closed the exits on your story? And that's just a way that I talk about of not having multimedia somewhere else, but really have a single story for people so they don't run away from your story to get parts of it. When you're promoting a story, how will people find it? If they can't find it, why did you write it? Why should they click on it? And why should they share it? Because that's how your story will find an even broader audience you couldn't imagine. Finally, when you're listening, when it's out there on Twitter and you see people talking about it, who's talking about it? Do they have new ideas? Are there criticisms to address? And then I think it's our job to respond, to answer our readers, and ultimately to make more stories, which is why we're all here. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.